You're looking at Dawn Wiggins. DawnWigginsTherapy.com is where you'll find her. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist. We're going to take your questions tonight. And Dawn picked a great topic for us, and we're going to be talking about that urge. How do you deal with that urge, that excruciating urge to contact an ex? Talk about heartbreak as you see it and the idea of urges.
I find that one of the most difficult things for people to overcome is that urge to reach out. And a lot of times my clients tell me that they want closure and that they're looking for some kind of closure in a conversation or a follow-up. And I find that a lot of times my clients in those instances don't really have a clear understanding of their motive, why they really want to reach out. And maybe it's that they're not able to be honest with themselves, or they're really not clear. But it also just might be an unmet need that they're still trying to get from that person.
Let's talk about the fix, that need. We're in such need of relief from what we're going through. Can we talk about the intensity of those feelings when we're not in contact and what we're going through?
Right. So we would call those feelings, we could call it a craving as much as we could call it an urge. Like if we're drawing a comparison between, a substance that someone would use, or an urge to gamble, or an urge to buy a beautiful handbag, that idea that becomes obsessive and we can't put the thought down. And we genuinely feel completely powerless over the thought and the feeling that I have to do this. I have to. No, you don't understand. I have to. And the problem usually is really full blown at that point, when you really believe that this is something that you have to do in order to be okay. And that means that the pain is usually pretty high at that point. And
because your body's telling you this, right?
Sure, there is, it's both, right? It's a mind-body connection. You cannot separate the two. The mind and the body are intrinsically linked. So what's happening in the mind is having an effect on the body, and vice versa. And so when you're experiencing that urge, there's a certain adrenaline rush. There's an obsessive component in the mind. And so there's a certain amount of chemicals that are being circulated. Cortisol, there is a craving really for dopamine in the brain at that point, because that dopamine dump that you get when you make contact, or when you bite that piece of pizza, or when you buy that pair of shoes, it is immediate relief. And it is temporary, but it is immediate, and it feels so good, and it is relief from the pain. And a lot of times when we get stuck in that cycle of obsession, the only thing we can think of is getting immediate relief, and a long-term solution doesn't really feel feasible in that moment.
For anyone who's not familiar, can you explain the dopamine dump?
Sure. So the brain works with different neurotransmitters, and there are certain chemicals that help us to feel good and balanced, and to have a balanced mood. And there are lots of different things that affect our brain chemistry, including, remember, there's a mind-body connection. So including how stressed we are, how well rested we are, our gut health. Believe it or not, we create neurotransmitters in our intestinal tract, of all places. And so dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters that helps us to feel good. And when we don't have enough dopamine, we can be experiencing symptoms of depression. And in a severe lack of dopamine, this is just kind of a little interesting factoid, that's what happens with Parkinson's patients. So when we get a dump of dopamine, meaning an immediate release of extra dopamine, we get that rush of feeling really good. And so that happens early in relationships, in that courtship phase. We have extreme levels of dopamine. That's not the only neurotransmitter that gets released, and that's certainly not the only chemical that happens. When you use cocaine and certain other drugs, there is an excessive amount of dopamine that gets released. A lot of antidepressants work with dopamine. And so dopamine is a really important part of the chemical components of the brain that feels good. And so that's really what we're craving without knowing it a lot of times when we want to feed that monster of obsession, if you will.
now that we know what's happening, then comes the moment of truth. We want to feel that rush. We have a choice to make. We can either do what we need to do in order to fill that, or we can tell ourselves that we're going to live without it, right?
Well, I wouldn't want to tell myself that I could live without it because I don't think I can. And I wouldn't want to tell a client to think that way either. So I would definitely make a recommendation to find it in other places. But that's really a long-term solution, right? That takes time, consistency over time. And so in that moment where the obsession is cramping everything that we're thinking and feeling and doing, you've got to have a plan. If you don't have a plan and you don't have a go-to and you haven't rehearsed that, you're going to go to the old choice every time because it's practiced, right? What we practice, we make permanent. And so when we've practiced satisfying the urge by acting on the obsession so many times, unless we have we've made a conscious choice and we have a conscious plan to execute, we're going to repeat the past. So
right.
There have to be.
And to clarify, I meant live without it as far as the X is concerned. So I think we're talking about the same thing. Let's get right to a question right off the bat from Nisa, who says, even though you're saying to reach out brings immediate relief, the pain you feel afterwards when your ex responds negatively or not at all is worse. How do you deal with that? But that's sort of like the low in the aftermath with any drug, right?
Absolutely. There is a direct correlation between the high that comes with the rush of the drug, whether it's, the reaching out to the ex or drug use or binge eating or whatever it is, and then the shame of getting rejected or having some other negative consequence, because that's really the mainstream kind of lay definition of addiction, right? Is negative use continued use despite negative consequences. So that negative consequence of getting rejected, getting more of the same old crap, and then the shame of having relapsed, the shame of having let ourselves down and gone there, and feeling just so terribly about ourselves in that moment, and even further from our goal of having some recovery, having some long-term relief.
If we haven't been trained to get that feeling elsewhere, like you alluded to earlier, and in that moment, if the need to reach out is so strong because that craving is so strong, is it almost like our actions at that point are involuntary, or do we still have the ability to choose not to carry it through?
We have the ability. It's not involuntary. For some people, it could be involuntary, right? I don't want to paint with like a completely broad brush, but for the majority of us, there is a choice. We don't perceive that, though. It doesn't feel like there's a choice in that moment, and that's because we're what I call amygdala hijacked. In that moment, there is that emotional part of our brain deep in our limbic system. It's called the primal brain or the lizard brain, and the amygdala is in there, and that's where we feel those primal feelings of fear or sadness or shame at such a base level that our rational or logical brain is not as engaged as our emotional brain. And so it feels so powerfully like we don't have a choice, but we do. And so there is the value and the importance of strategy in those moments so that we can argue back with the emotional mind in that point, because it's imbalanced in that moment.
It's the rational brain versus the what part of our brain?
So the amygdala is a part of the brain that processes primal human emotion. So sometimes it's referred to as the lizard brain, as a throwback, to basic evolution. We have these basic primal feelings of anger, fear, sadness, shame, the basic things. And so in those moments, the feelings of intensity, we feel that we don't have a choice because our logical, rational brain has taken a step back to the amygdala hijack, our amygdala getting hijacked by those primal emotions.
So when we work on ourselves to try to deal with these situations, what we're trying to do is what? Strengthen the rational brain?
Not so much necessarily as learning how to bring them into balance. So if there is an imbalance, which sometimes one part of our brain can be more overdeveloped than the other, but when we're working on ourselves, what we're really doing is learning to catch the signs of an amygdala hijack happening as it's building. And for some of us, it happens that fast, and some of us, it might build a little more slowly, but it's about learning how to recognize when I'm about to completely lose it emotionally and lose touch with my rational brain. So the mind-body connection can be very valuable there because there's going to be more signs when you're really in touch with your body, but also really kind of being able to deconstruct what an escalation period would look like so that you can interrupt it before you get to a total amygdala hijack.
We can also have a conversation with ourselves, right? We should recognize when this is happening, right?
That's one of the most helpful things, is to recognize as the intensity is increasing, and then make some different choices before it gets to that point of feeling out of control.
And that's where the strategies are involved.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I guess we should get into that.
Yeah.
Oh, you were going to say sometimes.
Well, sometimes. So I took a call from someone who was really struggling with this exact topic once, and I was shopping with my family at Target, and so I was in the back of the store and I didn't have a good signal, and so before I could get out to the store and to get to where there was some privacy, I just was literally texting that person math questions, and that was just a Band-Aid in that moment, but it was literally just to kind of start to peel back just a little bit that irrational lizard brain that was full blown at that point, just to get them thinking in a logical way. If I have to stop and I have to focus on a math equation, and really struggle to get it right, then I'm automatically engaging a different part of the brain. And so that was a strategy that I used once with someone struggling with this in the moment.
And so as you're shifting focus, what's actually happening in the brain?
You're literally de-escalating the amygdala, which actually literally starts vibrating at an intense level, and you're moving into more of the prefrontal cortex. So that's the area of the brain that's responsible for executive functioning. And so you're literally shifting which part of the brain is highlighted at that point, and you're giving the emotional part of the brain time to relax and slow down, so that when you come back to the topic, when you come back to the idea or the sensation, it won't feel as intense.
So everyone who's listening, I want to point out that the culprit here is not your ex necessarily. The culprit for the way you feel, the sort of the bad actor in all of this, is the amygdala. Is that a stretch to say?
No, I don't think so. And it's how we interact with it also, right? So it's like our training about how we interact with the amygdala. And I'm sure there's some other things, like some personality structure issues, and how well we're caring for ourselves in that moment. So like if we're exhausted, or if we're starving, that old saying, hungry, angry, lonely, tired.
Right.
So the amygdala is the angry part of hungry, angry, lonely, tired.
So in the certain landscapes, this thing can be worse or less intense depending on what it is. Let's talk about the amygdala as an interested party, okay? Since we're on the subject.
Yeah.
What does the amygdala want?
The amygdala wants to fully express its emotion. So if you let it run wild, it wants to punch a hole through a window, or it wants to defend at the highest level. That's its evolutionary purpose, is to keep you safe. So its perception is that whatever it's going to do is going to protect you. So if you're having an argument, or you're feeling scared, or whatever it is that primal feeling, its perception is that it is going to defend you.
What does the amygdala want where cravings are concerned?
So a craving is typically going to be come from a thought that tells us I'm not going to be okay unless I have this contact. A lot of self-deprecating thoughts, like no one else is going to love me, or I'm going to be alone forever, or why doesn't my ex still care about me, or do I still matter? A lot of stuff about worthiness, right? So it's almost it's almost perceiving a threat on an existential level, like what value do I have? Am I important? Am I disappearing? Like, can you see me? Am I worthy? And so those are threats to our self-worth, to our value,
And
our
then
perceived value.
and then the amygdala wants to do what in that spot?
It wants to defend against that crushing blow to the ego. And so a lot of times the solution can be that desperate request for attention. Or it could be an angry, we don't always want to talk to an ex just because we're pining, right? Sometimes we have so much anger we want to express, or that we want to act out
Right.
with an ex. And so whether it's an angry response or a desperate response, it's an act of survival.
And the contact somehow helps. Meaning, not helps, that's the wrong word.
Creates a sensation of relief.
Which the amygdala, as it's defending you, knows that the relief, that relief is somehow primally helpful in that minuscule moment, right?
Yeah, and it's enough to, typically it's enough for it to at least let go of the obsession.
But so the amygdala basically is not very smart, because if the amygdala was a bit smarter, it would know.
That's why it's called the lizard brain. It's like
right. So we're coming full circle here. It's not very smart, because if it knew better, it would know that this is actually longer term even more of an existential or dangerous problem.
Yeah, sure.
So now we turn to the executive functioning, the part of our brain that may realize that this is so, and that it's not a good idea. The more high functioning part of the brain that says, you know what? Don't listen to the amygdala, right? What does that part of our brain want?
So the executive functioning part of our brain wants to be in control. It's the part of our brain that is responsible for decision making, for attention span. And so it's the part that can maintain some level of concentrated focus and can process higher level problem solving, which is exactly what we want to do when we're in this conundrum, right? We want to be able to problem solve. We want to be able to sustain our attention on something other than this thing that has been obsessing in our brain. And so, yeah, it wants to manage things. It wants to organize things. It wants to have balance and peace and space.
And so it's probably that part of us that gets frustrated when we do things that are very chaotic and drawn from the actions of the amygdala, right?
So I'm using anecdotal information here, like just enough science to be dangerous, basically.
Right.
Because the brain is so complex, and I am fascinated with the brain. I study it regularly. I include it and incorporate it into my practice of therapy because I think that it's so important to validate what we're doing in therapy. But I find that the prefrontal cortex, and most of the research that we have available to us, that a lot of our prefrontal cortexes are not as fully developed as they could be. And that there's a lot of things that we do these days that almost stunt the growth of the prefrontal cortex or inhibit its it's maturation, if you will. So
I was going to say maturation, right?
Yeah. So okay. So all the things that we do, like on social media and those kinds of things, where our attention span is constantly diverted and we're never satisfied with just sitting still and being, those things all contribute to the atrophy almost of the prefrontal cortex. So there was a Buddhist philosopher or monk that once said that all of life's problems come from not being able to sit quietly by oneself in a room for an hour. And so that would be the prefrontal cortex that would be primarily responsible for being able to peacefully sit in a room by oneself for an hour without feeling anxiety or the need to connect.
And the amygdala may mean well, but at the end of the day, it doesn't know what's best for us necessarily.
That's very well put.
Folks, I bet when you're dealing with this stuff, you're not thinking the amygdala.
Right.
And I hope after today is something that's more on the brain, and no pun intended, that there's more conversations that you're having with yourself and with people here in the community about it and how it affects you. Because, and we've said this over and over and over again, and you probably would agree here, is that we believe that this is us. Like, we're wondering, why are we doing this? Why are we like this? And we're trying to rationalize these things in our heads, when in fact there are these forces going on that are very powerful that we don't have a relationship with and don't quite understand. But once it starts to make sense to us, the more we learn about it, the more we'll know what's happening and the more we'll be ready to deal with it, wouldn't you say?
And that's why a forum like this one that you've created is so valuable, because there are so many answers out there. There's so much to introspect about, and the more we learn about ourselves, absolutely, the more that we can get long-term relief from the problems that we're having instead of continuing the same patterns. So yeah, this is a great forum for those of you out there that are looking for relief in a long-term way, if you're really looking for a solution and not just to address the symptoms in a really short-term manner, but to really find a solution so that you can get out of this rut.
You're listening to Dawn Wiggins, licensed marriage and family therapist. DawnWigginsTherapy.com is where you'll find more about her. So now that we know what we're dealing with a little bit better, now it really gets to the nitty-gritty of what we do about it. And folks, I want you to feel free, and I see Circus Act has a question here, and we'll get to that one because I want to stay on topic, but we will get to it. And if you have any questions, folks, that focus on what we're talking about right now that are on topic, I'd love to get those in. But we get to the nitty-gritty of, okay, so how do we train ourselves? How do we work with the executive part of our brain so that we can deal with these situations and deal with these cravings? And by the way, they happen in the middle of the night too, when we don't have anyone to really talk to necessarily, when the world's asleep.
You brought up that these things happen in the middle of the night, because I think a lot of times one of the best solutions, is to have someone to talk to connect with, and not just because someone else can solve our problems, because they can't. But when we get talking with someone, it shifts the gears from that lizard brain into a more executive functioning. If somebody's asking us, oh, tell me more about what's going on, and even if it's somebody just asking us the silliest questions, like what did we do that day, or what did we have for dinner, that causes us to shift focus. And so I know in my own personal development journey, one of the most valuable tools I had in my tool belt was to have a list of people that were okay with me calling, even if it was the middle of the night. And that can be one of the hardest things to do. They talk about the phone weighing 10,000 pounds and feeling unworthy to be a burden to somebody else. And the truth is that connection is the antidote to depression, that isolation causes obsession to get worse. And so in any 12-step forum, you're always going to have people who are handing out a phone list, and it's for that reason. Because in those moments of isolation, it's the hardest to break the cycle.
But isn't it, though, let's talk about that in the context of a community like the one we're in now, where we know we're dealing with people who very well understand what's happening to us and how we're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And we feel, like you said, the phone feels like it weighs 10,000 pounds. It's very difficult to make that call. Versus the list of people that are out there in the real world who we feel like we're a burden to, or we just don't feel we connect with at this moment in time, because the connection really isn't based on similarity of situation and circumstance and feelings, right? What's that?
Relatability, where you're gonna, you don't have
right.
to worry that someone's gonna not understand, or they're gonna shame you or say that again.
So before
So
before these kinds of calls and contacts happen, what are some of the strategies that, how can we train ourselves? And we've had, for those of you who are just coming to us now, we've had 30 minutes plus of an extraordinary and fascinating conversation of exactly what's happening in our brain that makes us feel this way and makes these urges so intense. But what can we do to strengthen? So we're going to get to these calls in the list soon, but just so that there's got to be, assuming we didn't have that phone, there's got to be something we can do even on our own, right? That strengthens that executive portion of the brain, that gives balance to that force that we hope would carry us forward and that has our better interests at heart.
Yep. So your strategy is going to depend on the intensity of the problem, right? So you know that if it feels impossible to not reach out, that you have repeatedly relapsed and the intensity is excruciating, then you know that your plan has to be that much more strong and have layers to it. One tool is typically never enough. There has to be a willingness to use a tool, and if that tool isn't enough, another tool and another tool and another tool. It's not enough to just try something and say it didn't work. There really has to start with the willingness and a choice to say, I'm going to execute this plan till the end. And I'm going to get as far as I can. So there's so many choices, but it also depends on the setting, right? Are you in the middle of your work day? Are you out and about by yourself? Are you at the grocery store? Are you in your car driving? So it kind of depends on the setting, on what kind of plan you're going to execute. So, you know, some of the more rational things that you can do while you're sitting at a desk or you're in the car or you're somewhere in a public place, you know, are logical thought processes, like saying the ABCs backwards, doing complex math problems, trying to recite the lyrics to your favorite song without the song actually playing, interrupting anything that's actually causing the pain to persist more. So like if you're listening to music that's triggering you, turning it off. Or if you saw a commercial or you had a memory that triggered something, you know, change the channel, change the room you're sitting in, change the temperature on the thermostat, go get something to drink. A lot of times when I'm having people, I get a feedback like, Dawn, you're crazy. Like, saying the alphabet backwards is not going to solve my problem. And if that's what you're reacting with right now, like, you know, doing math is not going to solve my problem. Trying to recite lyrics is not going to solve my problem. You're absolutely right. These are not things that are going to solve your problem long term. These are tactics to deal with the amygdala hijack in the moment, just to get yourself to a point of rational thinking so that you can execute a little more refined strategy, if you will. So you want to do something to de-escalate the intensity of the feelings. I have one client who swore by Candy Crush that it was the just perfect thing to change the channel in her brain. You know, longer term strategies like mindfulness, meditation, tapping. There are a lot of great training videos out there about tapping, things that can help us manage intense anxiety or intense loneliness and desperation. There are a lot of great, you know, medium to long term strategies. You know, the things that I was just sharing were really short term, immediate answers to changing the channel in your brain, if you will.
And again, what makes it so interesting is that we're not really talking, it's not about math. It's the fact that in the moment, the amygdala is about to hijack the brain and make you do something. And by doing some of these other things at your most intense moment, at these as these moments are intensifying, what it's doing is it's backing the amygdala away, because what? It's bringing in that part of your brain that is the more executive function, the more logical function. And so you're trying to access that so that, think of it as, like we said earlier, the two titans at war. You're giving that part of you that you can actually put more faith in, you know, or you should be putting more faith in. You're giving it more strength to win that battle.
Yeah, and the more, so part of what we're talking about, I'm sure that you've covered in other shows, but we're talking about bringing ourselves to this immediate time and space, to right now in this moment. And so the more you can engage your various senses, sight, touch, sound, taste, smell, the more senses you can engage, the more power you're going to have to interrupt that amygdala hijack. So there's a cool trend these days with fidget toys, like intentionally for the purpose of fidgeting. And that can actually be very powerful. Also, having something tactile in your fingers to do at the same time as you're doing math or reciting poetry or whatever it is. The goal is to engage your senses. You're distracting yourself in essence, but in a very intentional, specific way that you have planned ahead of time. And a lot of times it's helpful to know for yourself what are the ways that you respond best. Do you respond really well to aromatherapy, to fragrance? Do you respond more visually? Do you respond more tactilely? Like, know yourself enough to create a strategy that's going to work best for you. This isn't just like winging it, right? And just like waiting till the next time you feel like crap and saying, okay, I'm going to do math. No, it's not about math. It's about knowing yourself and knowing what strategy is going to work best for you.
Because ultimately we're creating a mechanism by which to fend for ourselves and defend ourselves, right?
Yes. Yes.
We have to become our protectors, don't we?
Yes. That's the long-term solution to this problem of the pain of a breakup. That's the long-term solution, is recognizing that there is no other human out there that can rescue me. I have to take responsibility for my feelings, and I can't keep going to my ex to try to soothe what I'm feeling. I have to be willing to take responsibility.
Because the amygdala will look to the ex.
The amygdala will look to a lot of things, but yes, the ex. Yeah, the amygdala will look to anything that will provide an immediate solution. So that could be getting angry at your best friend because they looked at you wrong or weren't supportive enough, right? But the amygdala is not looking to take responsibility for its feelings. No.
And folks, to reiterate, that's why they call it lizard brain. It's a dumb part of our brain.
Primal, yeah. It's not very well, it's not enhanced.
Going to get to some questions. And I'm going to get to you, Circus Act, in a moment. Heal Me says, deep breaths help. I noticed you didn't mention breathing, but can you talk about it, Dawn?
Oh, absolutely. I didn't leave it out intentionally. Breath work is one of the most powerful. There's science behind that. When we breathe deeply, as Heal Me mentioned, it's because when we draw our breath down into our bellies, we engage the diaphragm. The diaphragm makes contact with the vagus nerve. And I know I'm getting into some complex science here, but the vagus nerve runs from the base of our spine into our, down from our tailbone into our brainstem, and it communicates with the central nervous system and sends the messages that it's okay to relax, that it's okay to disengage that fight or flight response that is paired with the amygdala. So the deep breaths literally are one of the best and most powerful ways, but they have to be deep and intentional and long enough to have an effect. So not just one or two, you would need to do as many cycles as it takes for you, and you need to know yourself to know how many deep breaths. And sometimes deep breaths alone aren't going to do it for you, depending again on the intensity of your pain. But that the diaphragm to the vagus nerve to the central nervous system is kind of the path that it takes to de-escalating that fight or flight or amygdala response.
Okay, and the next question or comment comes from Shetri, who says, he has blocked any communication with me. It's been 20 days since I've heard from him. I was with him for 16 months. I've tried every day to reach out with no response. So sad. And so here we have somebody who's reaching out. And, you know, it really goes to what we've been talking about. What can we say to Shetri?
What are you looking for? What are you hoping for? Sometimes I call this going to the hardware store looking to buy a gallon of milk. They don't sell milk at Home Depot. And so if you keep going to Home Depot every day to buy milk, at some point you're going to say to yourself, maybe I ought to look for Publix. That's what we have in Florida. And so that's what that reaching out is doing. You know, if you kept doing that same thing, at some point you'd be like, why do I keep doing this? And so it sounds like the reaching out isn't getting old for you yet. And so why not? What are you looking for? Because this isn't going to solve your problem. And so this is where you saying, okay, I'm going to make an empowered choice here. I'm going to make an empowered choice to take care of my emotional needs. And I'm going to look inside and I'm going to make a plan to go buy milk where they sell milk. Because clearly your ex is not willing to be a milk vendor. So can you be willing to go somewhere where you can get your needs met? Am I sounding crazy?
Well, yeah, well, but when we say milk, what you're talking about here, the milk
answer.
Right, it's that feeling of wholeness and being loved. It's that is what we're talking about. And it goes again to what we're saying. So when you say, what are we looking for? After we've just had this conversation, we know what we're looking for, don't we? Meaning, in the context of our discussion, we know that we're looking for that feeling. We're looking to recapture that feeling, right?
Yeah, and ideally, after that many days, I would really ask you to look inside and to just reassure you that you can't find the feeling. You're not going to find the feeling there. That dopamine dump is long gone at this point. There is a paired stimulus at this point with the chase. Hope. That hope has been misplaced. And the dopamine dump is almost coming from the chase more than the actual contact at this point. And so we're having to back it up even further. Can you be willing to part with the chase and the adrenaline that comes with that, and to interrupt the belief that you're going to get a good feeling even from just looking for it, from that sensation of hope when you wake up in the morning? Maybe today I'll craft the just perfect message and it'll get their attention.
And really, when you talk about the chase, in lieu of actually having the contact, then the closest thing to it is the chase, is the effort to gain the contact, right?
Yep. And it does provide that little bit, not the same amount, but that little bit of that sensation.
It's not the mother load.
No.
And is that where the desperation starts to develop, is because it's so little that it's trickling in now?
Yeah,
and more of it, and that's why we sort of keep doing it?
Well, and part of it at this point is also about a decline of, so it's not just at that point about looking for the dopamine, it's about a decline of all of the other feel-good neurotransmitters, because our focus has become so narrow that our self-worth keeps dropping and dropping and dropping. And depression is probably building at that point. Isolation is really entrenched at that point. And so it's not just about the dopamine dump or the amygdala at that point. There are so many other factors that have us believing that we're literally trapped in that moment.
And Chetri says that we spoke every day, all day. So what about that as a setup? Meaning there was so much there. There was so much communication that it's even that the withdrawal is even more stark here, isn't it?
So at that point, there's a concern around identity, meaning if we spoke every day, all day, and that's where I kind of got my breath from, then in the absence of that, it's literally can feel like you can't breathe, or you don't know what to do next, or you don't even know how to pick a menu item or to make a choice, a simple choice. And so there's something that needs to be cultivated there and developed in terms of your own individual identity, because it's almost like it's been fused or borrowed from somebody else's constant input and feedback. And that part of ourselves that knows who we are and what we like and what to do next has gone into hiding. And so there's that sensation of true, like being lost and not knowing where to find air.
When Nisa says just knowing that reaching out is going to cause me more pain actually helps me and prevents me from actually doing it, because the logic of that is making more sense to me. So we want more people to feel that way, right?
So we call that playing the tape through, right? So when we're in the chase and we're in that urge or that craving, that temptation, and the central nervous system is starting to gear up for that fight or flight, the amygdala is starting to weigh in, and we play the tape through, as Nisa, I think, is alluding to. What's it going to feel like if I do actually make contact afterwards? How's that going to go? How's it gone in the past? What was the outcome? And then how long did the painful feeling last after the fact? And how long did the good feeling last? And so sometimes when we can expand on that knowing, like really blow it up, then it can be even more powerful. To really, and to write it down. When we write these things down, there's something magic that happens between the brain, the pen, and the paper. Writing it with a pen and paper is even better than typing it on your phone or on a computer, because we're processing feelings and we're reinforcing new neural networks in our mind when we're writing things down. So to just validate your strategy, Nisa, if we are writing down exactly how it's going to play out and exactly how long it's going to hurt for versus how long it's going to feel better for, that's where we really can capture the power of that strategy. Does that make sense?
Yep. And Heal Me says, I sometimes check her social media, but don't want to contact her directly because I don't want to give her power. How can I enforce my willpower from checking her Instagram?
So social media, there is just starting to be some really hard evidence about causation versus correlation of social media, meaning we're starting to understand that social media is actually causing depression and not just correlated with depression, meaning that it's not that depressed people or isolated people or heartbroken people are more drawn to social media and it's being reinforced. Social media is actually causing these issues in a lot of cases. So the reality is taking a break from social media is probably the best strategy.
And Heal Me has 40 days of not initiating contact.
Awesome.
And then Heal Me, when you say, is that dopamine fixed too?
On Instagram, yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
basically, with the counting, and we have a sobriety count of not initiating contact, with the sobriety, if we can then look, as you were talking about much earlier in this broadcast, that if we can then find those other things that are going to supplant the dopamine, that's when we'll start to get a handle on this stuff, right?
Yeah, and what we're looking for is a more even keel, right? Because the contact is creating these highs and then these sharp lows. And so with more sobriety, and I would guess that your followership would reinforce this, that with more sobriety, there's a more even balance. And that when you start to experience happy things in life with, just your day-to-day life, the more distance you get, the more you can experience that joy. Whereas when you're in the really, really early stages, it's hard to feel anything other than the high and the low related to the contact.
How long does it take to reclaim your full identity and feel good doing the things that give you joy?
It totally depends. That's a terrible answer, right? But it depends on how hard you work, how willing you are to find your identity. There is some research that I have learned about recently that says after 6 months it gets easier, but I think that depends on what you're doing with your 6 months. So the research says that, so this is kind of an amalgamation of research, right? But that if you lost someone due to death, that after 6 months your risk of major health issues or major depression is lessened. So in terms of heartbreak itself, 6 months is one of those timelines that, we can kind of lean on and say things get better, but that doesn't mean that we've reclaimed identity at that point. That doesn't mean that we're feeling relief or we're feeling even. So it really depends on how willing you are to work a solution.
Right. We have to make the effort. It's not going to happen on its own. Recovery is a choice.
Correct.
W woman says, I think there's no way I can get him out of my head. Someone doesn't necessarily have to be out of your head for the severity or the intensity of it to de-escalate based on the efforts that you make. They can still be in your head. They can still be kicking around in there, but it just has a different,
but there's
a different consequence.
There's a more interesting nuance that I want to glom onto there. Part of recovery is believing it's possible. So if you find yourself struggling with the thought that you can't, then that's the first thing to tackle.
Oh, that's interesting.
A longer term strategy, because if you're walking around doubting your ability to heal, good luck.
That's interesting. So the first step is sort of dealing with the premise.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's one of my go-tos that I hammer home with people, that there is a solution to every problem. And so I have to, for me, in my own recovery process and what I teach my clients, I really hammer home that the belief that it's possible has to exist. We don't have to know how, we don't have to know when, eventually we will know those things. Eventually those things will be revealed and we'll execute them. But when a client first comes in and sits down as in crisis, all that client needs to walk away with knowing that particular day is that it's possible. And I think that that's a powerful notion. That's a uniting notion. That's why we're all here on this platform together, right? Because this is a we program, and there's a solution in the we, that if I'm struggling with it and you're struggling with it and one of us has gotten better, then hey, it's possible. So we have to start with the idea, the belief that it is possible. Now, I understand that the question there was to get him or her out of my head. Well, probably not. That, that is a memory that has existed, and so short of erasing your brain or deleting parts of your brain, no. But I think that the message
we can get the intensity of him, yes, the meaning of him out of our heads. That's what we can get out, right?
The pain associated with the memory or the thoughts, absolutely.
This is our last question from Circus Act. How do we forgive ourselves for making a poor partner choice after being divorced and yet involved with the same type of partner?
I do a lot of work on forgiveness. This is not an easy, simple answer, but I love to teach people how to do forgiveness because it's a beautiful concept. We can all want it as bad as anything, but if you don't know how to execute it, then you stay stuck. And so I have an awesome YouTube video that is literally a step-by-step about how to forgive other people, but ultimately how to forgive yourself. And at the core of me making that video is because I myself am divorced and remarried. And so I've walked that path. I get it. And that's the place where I created that video from.
Can't thank you enough. Dawn Wiggins, DawnWigginsTherapy.com.
You got it.
She's a licensed marriage and family therapist. Thank you for the time, folks. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And
thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. And want to remind everyone, we're part of a community. There's a lot of caring that we all have for one another. And that connection that we all have, that's the dopamine we want. That's what our amygdala should be going for.
You got it.